Performance Training 2, Day 3. Today we're going to talk about recovery as it relates to volume, intensity, peaking and tapering, and periodization. Also, those are the main topics that we're going to be talking about in High Performance Training 2. To get right to it, we'll give you a quick description and maybe my definition of recovery, and then we'll refer you to some other resources that will help you get a better understanding of recovery. My definition and description of recovery is in between rounds when you actually slow down your heart rate and or your mind. Times when you get a break between training and processing and or thinking. And I guess the last sort of definition would be an extended amount of time where there isn't really any high performance training going on. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about periodization. Some people call the off season or the transition period a larger type of recovery. Now I'm going to give you some references that you can actually look into, and then we'll go into a different area of descriptions today with recovery. I put out 2 other resources online. Again, you can go to therealcircle.com and you can click on HPT in the left menu. That stands for High Performance Training. Then on that page, you'll have several videos actually. Psychological Skills Training is on the bottom of the page, and at the top of the page is High Performance Training, where I give you basically 3, I think they're about 15 or 20 minute descriptions of some of the more interesting and or unique parts of periodization. The top 3 that I think are most important, and I've kind of combined all of the, we have about 7 topics here that we're talking about. I've kind of combined them into 3 different videos there with a slideshow to give you a little bit more information. I also, on Coach Shannon Talks, have a description of recovery, and some of that information actually is different. Actually, most of it is different, but some of the topics in terms of the recovery, the topic is the same, but the information is a little bit different. So I highly suggest listening to and reviewing both of those prior to listening to this one. However, if that's impossible, all 3 are going to be helpful to give you a better understanding of recovery, to give you a better description so that you can make certain that you're putting recovery as a big part of your training. Okay, so on one of those resources, I suggested that recovery is what is sped up by anabolic steroids. Okay, anabolic steroids are actually illegal, and the Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, NCAA, and most state governing bodies have made them illegal because they do detrimental damage to your body. On the other hand, one of the reasons why a lot of athletes and sports scientists suggested and recommended that illegal drug, again, I want to stress that it's illegal so you don't go out there and try to use it, but what I do want to point out is studies have shown that the recovery time is increased with those illegal drugs. Again, I'm stressing that performance-enhancing drugs, in this case, anabolic steroids, are illegal. The reason why a lot of people used anabolic steroids was to speed up recovery. In essence, when your recovery is sped up, that means you can actually train more adequately in a training design. So really quickly, I'm going to give you a couple of different analogies, and then I'm going to refer back to sport. If you had unlimited time to study and your mind never went, I guess, blank or got fatigued or didn't require a rest, would you be more ready for giving a presentation on the subject that you were studying, or taking a test on the subject that you were studying, or reciting the information by memory that you were studying? Keep in mind, you don't need a recovery. You don't even need sleep. Maybe we'll enhance it just a little bit. You don't even need sleep as much as you would normally do because your recovery is actually sped up. So in that sense, instead of studying for, most people can study for about an hour without a break. You study for 3 hours, and then you maybe get something to eat. Then you study for another 3 hours, and you get something to eat, and then you study for another 3 hours. Basically, you do a work day of studying, because your mind doesn't have to have a recovery. Normally, it's really difficult to do that type of studying, because after you've studied for a while, you kind of, you get tired, your mind gets fatigued. Now, so can you see how I'm suggesting that the recovery is a huge part of you being able to recall information with regard to studying? I'm turning it on its head and suggesting that because you do not need any recovery at all, your mind can continuously study and study and study and study and study and study and study. Now that's like abnormal. That doesn't happen. You need a recovery in order to refresh, so that you get a break, so that you can come back. But in this case, that's kind of what anabolic steroids did from a athletic point of view. It gave the athletes an ability to continue to train with minimal recovery time, and in fact, it sped up the recovery time. In sport, the reason why the recovery is effective is because your mind and your body actually get fatigued. When you get fatigued, you actually slow down. The mental processes in your mind actually slow down, and then your body actually slows down. It's just harder to do it without getting into too much physiology. Your muscles actually get tired because they've done 10 repetitions of whatever, and you can no longer continue to do that. Maybe 100 repetitions of whatever in, let's say, 3 to 4 minutes. That's about, likely half of a wrestling match. That's about how many movements you would likely make. Because you've done that at a high pace and with a lot of power, you need a little bit of recovery. So I'm just giving you a description of what recovery is and how it can affect your ability to train. And then we're going to give you some examples, more examples with sport and other sports outside of wrestling where recovery has become a huge issue. Some other examples in other sports, and just as an aside, I'm an athlete and I'm a coach, and I watch a lot of sports, and I do a lot of research on other sports to see how I can apply that to my training and help athletes become better athletes. In fact, as an aside again, I suggest athletes and coaches look into other sports and pick out what some of the best ideas are in those sports and see if they can work in our great sport. I suggest that's a good idea to work on. Anyhow, in other sports like soccer and or basketball and or baseball, I pay attention to what the sportscasters are saying, the athletes are saying, and the coaches are saying. And lately, what a lot of coaches have figured out, I think probably since the 90s, at least on this part of the world, they figured out that athletes need a break, especially professional athletes, because the seasons are so long. Again, recovery, we're tying in recovery, and we're giving you descriptions, definitions of recovery. As an example, in basketball, they play in the USA, professional basketball, they play 82 games a year. Now, can all of the players on the team play 82 games a year? Yeah, they could. Every minute of the game? Yeah, they could. Do they? Probably not. One of the reasons why they have substitutions in many sports is because athletes get injured and they need to put somebody else in there. Maybe emotionally the athlete is kind of distracted. They need to get somebody else in there, and or the athlete is just tired. All three are indicating different types of recovery. One is recovery from injury. The person is injured and they need time off so that they can get back to their homeostasis or where they need to be. Another one is psychological frustration or fatigue, where at that moment they need a break, they need to recover, and they need to get the heck out of there so they can calm their mind down and then they can get back in. And the third is physical fatigue, where they just, they've been pushed beyond their limit and then they need a 1 or 2 minute break and then they can go back in. Anyhow, I'm suggesting that recovery is built into a lot of sports based on those three concepts. Another concept in sports is taking the athlete completely out of the game from the point A to point B, meaning a lot of coaches, professional sports, especially in basketball, they figured out that, it's 82 games, but what's the most important part of our season? The playoffs and the championship season, which is at the end of the year. If I put my athletes in the game for all of the minutes for 82 games, will they have enough left to make it through the playoff run and or the championship series? a lot of coaches have figured out that that's not realistic. That's why they have a 5-man starting on the team, and then they usually have 7 to 10 other players on the team, so that they can substitute based on those 3 parameters I gave you earlier: physical fatigue, mental fatigue, and then injuries. And or they just want to take that person completely out of the game because they understand that if they play 82 games, they may not have enough left to participate in the playoffs and the championship season. You'll see that a lot in basketball in the USA. You'll see it a lot, and nowadays I watch a lot of international soccer. You'll see it a lot in soccer too, or international football, where they have roughly about 82 games a year too, and because they don't have the ability to substitute during their games, they a lot of times will sit athletes out for the whole, especially if they've got 2 or 3 games in 1 week. They realize that we can't have our athletes playing because their sport's a little bit different, where they have their regular season, and sometimes they'll have tournaments right in the middle of their season. So they figured out that if we play our athletes in all of these games up to 70 or 80 games, our best players may be fatigued, or most of the players on our team could be fatigued. So a lot of times they'll have a reserve squad of players, so they'll rotate those players. Again, we're talking about recovery and how this can impact in a person's season so that they can perform towards the end of the year where it's most important, which is typically the playoffs and the championship season, or the championship. So I've given you 2 different definitions, or 2 different examples from sport, and now I'm going to give you a third definition or example. In individuals, those are 2 team sports, right? In individual sports, we have the same challenge, and I'll use gymnastics and tennis and golf as examples. Typically, those sports can play or compete every single weekend, or at least once a month. And if they're international, once a month is that's not a big deal. Once a month internationally means you could be traveling over 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 continents. Maybe not 6, maybe 5. Antarctica and the other one. Can't think of it right now. People don't go there to compete. Anyhow, the idea with recovery is if you're competing every single weekend, you don't have enough time to adequately train because you're traveling. So what a lot of individual sport athletes have figured out, and I'm using individual sports like gymnastics and tennis and golf to suggest that some of the athletes have figured out that when they compete all the time, they don't have enough energy to compete for their big tournaments. In golf and tennis, those are called the Grand Slam events, and most athletes in those sports, those are their prize. For Olympic athletes, it's the World Championships, Continental Championships, like the Pan Am Games or the Pan Am Championships or the European Games or the European Championships and the Olympic Games. Those are typically the big 3 that happen throughout the course of a career. Continental Championships are every year, the games are every 4 years, and then the Olympic Games are every 4 years. So the idea that you want to be peaked and tapered for those events, which we're actually going to talk about tomorrow on peaking and tapering, and then peaking and tapering there's a huge recovery concept built into that, which we'll focus on a little bit more tomorrow. But right now, I just want you to see how recovering for those events is important, and how do we do that. That's what we're actually going to talk about right now. Throughout the periodization model, and over the last 2 days anyway, with volume intensity, we've described mesocycles that have 2 building weeks and then 1 recovery week. What specifically is a recovery week? The recovery week is designed to lessen the volume of training. The intensity will always remain high, because if you take the intensity out, now the athletes aren't ready to compete. However, you can reduce the volume of training, meaning the minutes of training can actually go down with regard to how much you're training. So if you have a 2-hour practice, you could cut it back to an hour and a half practice during the recovery week. If you have an hour and a half practice, you could cut it back to an hour practice during recovery week. If you're doing this over the course of the year, and this is what I did at the United States Olympic Education Center, every 3rd week we had a recovery week, and then based on our schedule, I would schedule events based on our recovery week. I would schedule events at the end of our recovery week. Why? Because now the athletes are, pretty much recovered for that event. In other words, if athletes are tired going into an event, how do you think their competitions will be? it varies, right? Athletes can do amazing things, right? But over time, this is what I'm asking you to look at. Over time, over the course of a year or a career, how will they be at the end of the year? Now, go back to the examples of soccer and basketball. What did those coaches do? Those coaches gave the athletes breaks during the year so that they were ready to perform at their, key events, which is the playoffs and their major championships. So we need to be doing the same thing in our sport. And I'm suggesting to athletes and coaches that it's important to compete, it's important to train, it's also important to recover. Some other ways in which to recover beyond reducing the volume are the warm-up and the cool-down, right? And you're asking, well, how do those figure into the recovery? Number one, they are reduced intensities, typically, right? Typically the warm-up, you gradually build to a pace where you can get to a high intensity, and the recovery portion of it suggests that you're gradually building up, where you're not jumping right into a wrestling match and going 100 miles an hour. What that does is it gets your body ready. The cool down really is the same thing. That's a built-in recovery as well, because it's gradually slowing your body down. If you put one at the beginning and one at the end of the practice, all of a sudden now your practices are not as intense as they would be, because you've built in two particular ways to recover. Also, they help you get you ready for the practice, and they help you get ready for the next practice. That's another way that you can have built-in recovery while you're actually reducing the volume. Let's say if you have a recovery week. Another way to reduce recovery is to have variety in your practices. At the Olympic Training Center, we had 10 to 11 practices a week, and again, a lot of these concepts are very similar. So if you listen to one tape and then you listen to another tape, meaning the audio notes that I'm describing now, you'll kind of hear some information that's very similar. In this case, recovery can be added to your variety. Variety can be added to the recovery because you're doing different things. When you're doing different things, the intensity sometimes actually changes. Your mind actually gets a break, and then you actually aren't doing the same things over and over again, which is more of a psychological recovery, because if things are boring, if they're monotonous, if they're tedious, you can actually not enjoy the training, and then you can actually, take your mind off of training where you're not as focused. So having variety in the training is another form of recovering. How can you know if you're not getting enough recovery? How do you know if you're under recovered? One way that we talked about in high performance training PST was to have a training log and to monitor your training. This is one of the key concepts that we'll talk a little bit about again with the periodization communication talks that we'll have in the next 3 or 4 days here. The idea behind having a training log and monitoring your training is to see how fatigued you are. And there I gave some specific examples there on actual forms that you can use to measure how much you actually recovered. One indication could be if you're getting enough sleep, and that goes along with some of the basics of living. Sleeping actually adds to your recovery. If you're getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep, you can actually enhance your recovery. If you're not getting enough sleep, on the other hand, all of these things that we're talking about here are going to affect your recovery. So I'm painting a picture of how things are very interrelated, such as all of these topics are interrelated, and I think you need to have a very good understanding of them. But if you get the basics of living down with the right amount of sleep and eating the right nutrients, those also help you recover. Specifically with eating, within 1 hour after your training session, you need to eat. And I don't know if we talked about that on Psychological Skills Training HPT, but I will give you a different definition right now because we're talking about recovery. Right after the training session, your body has used up all of the nutrients and energy. So if you use the sponge example, it's like you've squeezed out all of the energy and nutrients of your body. So on the flip side, if you eat right after you train, within an hour or so, your body is more likely to absorb. It's not more likely, it's a fact. You can do some research on it if you like. Right after training, when you eat and drink adequate amounts of nutrients and fluids, your body absorbs them quicker, and then you're much more able to train again now, or you're much able to absorb and get those food nutrients into your body. If you wait for over an hour up to 3 hours, it absorbs more slowly. Now you're less likely to be ready for the next training session. So getting the right amount of sleep, 8 to 10 hours a day, I suggest for athletes, is going to help you actually recover. And eating within an hour of training is actually going to help you recover. So those are two concepts that are essentially basics of living that we talked about on one of the audio notes of High Performance Training PST, along with having a reduced volume of training during your mesocycles. And finally, I sort of suggested minimizing the amount of times that you're competing with the basketball example and the soccer example, where I don't believe it's essential for you to compete every single weekend, because if you do compete every single weekend and you're traveling, that affects your recovery in as much as your training has to be reduced if you're traveling. In fact, you don't train at all when you're traveling typically, but training is a huge part of you being able to compete at a high level. So if you reduce the amount of training because you're traveling and you're competing all the time, you're actually affecting your recovery in a way that is less likely to give you high performance training. Again, I refer you back to the basketball and football example, where a lot of coaches have figured out that our athletes don't need to play in every specific game. What they do need to do is be ready for the playoffs and the championship season. So just giving you a little bit of different information than I have on the other resources. Again, I'll refer you back to therealcircle.com. Click on HPT and look at the recovery session. And also, you can check out Coach Shannon Talks. There's a recovery session on there too. Listen to all three and understand all three, and then understand how you can track and monitor your recovery so that you can perform when you need to.